I am delighted tonight to welcome Tom Preston. I think this is Tom. This is the third time you've spoken to us about Ukraine, right? I think, and the all of them so far have been just outstanding, and I think this one will be too. Tom teaches a political science professor at Washington State University, where he is the C.E.O. Johnson Distinguished Professor of Political Science. And he has published widely on security issues. He's an expert on Russia. He's got a well-regarded book on political psychology. He's written books on the presidency and foreign policy. And so he'll be able to draw on all of those tonight. And so let me turn it over to Tom Preston, who will be talking about Ukraine, and I think I should forgot the title of your talk. I should have written it down.
I think the reality is, unfortunately, that Ukraine can't really be talked about in a bubble anymore. It's not in a vacuum, and I think we can't talk about pretty much anything, in foreign policy without placing it in the context of the real turnover that's happening because of Trump's sort of radical shift in American foreign policy. So let me talk about that. I'm going to share with you my PowerPoint here. Okay, does everybody see that fine?
No, I don't. Oh, there we go.
Okay, everybody can see it now?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, well, let me just go ahead and get started. I think you always know where things are going with a talk when it starts out quoting George Orwell. But George Orwell once wrote in his book 1984 about the Ministry of Truth, which would continually rewrite history to fit whatever policy or actions were supported by Big Brother and the party. And while Orwell's protagonist, Winston Smith, he worked at the ministry, he knew from his own memory that their Oceania had been allied with Eurasia as recently as 4 years ago. Now, suddenly the party declared there had never been an alliance, that Oceania was at war with Eurasia, therefore Oceania had always been at war with Eurasia. And so history was rewritten. Certainly, I think Vladimir Zelensky could be forgiven for feeling he had slipped into the pages of 1984 in that recent press conference as President Trump declared that he was a dictator, not the elected leader of Ukraine, and that it was Ukraine, the country ruthlessly invaded by Putin's Russia 3 years earlier, who had actually started the war. And our European allies, I think, could be equally forgiven for wondering how a United States, which had literally created the post-World War II world order, NATO in 1949, rebuilt Europe after World War II through the Marshall Plan, developed the world free trade regimes, promoted democracy, and worked with the European Union to achieve 70 years of peace, even through a Cold War, now decreed that all free trade was unfair, that trade wars and tariffs should be levied on the allies, that the EU had been created to screw the US, and NATO was of no value, Article 5 negotiable, and that Putin could do, quote unquote, whatever the hell he wanted with NATO allies who displeased Trump. I think it's fair to say that we've reached an inflection point, a fork in the road of either preserving the post-World War II order, our alliances, the stability and security they have provided, the economic system we created to benefit ourselves and stand with democracy against authoritarianism and dictatorships, or to cross the Rubicon, alone without allies, into a Hobbesian sort of dog-eat-dog world of might makes right, where morality has no place in our policies, and we turn our backs on things that made America a beacon for democracy, freedom, and stability in the world. To be honest, it is not a talk I ever imagined that I would need to give during my career. Right. And I've been an academic here at WC 30 years. I've been a consultant for the US government in various capacities for more than 30 years. First, I think we need to recount some key events that have taken place regarding Ukraine in order to understand the current situation. Now, I've already given several talks, as John noted, both here and at the Foley Institute. I think both of them are available online, where I go into a lot more of the details of the origins of the conflict. So I won't go too far into the weeds here tonight. There's a lot more things that we need to cover. But why the Ukrainians want more ironclad security guarantees in current peace talks is totally understandable given the past. When the Soviet Union dissolved and ceased to exist in December of 1991, Ukraine not only found itself an independent country, but one that had inherited thousands of Soviet nuclear weapons, making it, Ukraine, at that time, the third largest nuclear power in the world. But after lots of pressure from the US and others pursuing nuclear non-proliferation goals, Ukraine agreed to sign the Budapest Amendment or memorandum in December of 1994. In it, they agreed to return all of the nuclear weapons back to Russia in return for security guarantees by the US, Britain, and, wait for it, Russia, to protect Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity from external military and economic aggression. So let's be honest, Ukraine has trusted hollow American and Russian security guarantees in the past, and these weren't worth the paper they were printed on. Think they'd like that nuclear decision back now? No doubt there never would have been a Russian invasion had they remained a nuclear state. For Putin's part, he has taken aggressive actions throughout the region. In the face of NATO expansion during the late 1990s into Eastern Europe and the Baltics, Putin continually attacked this as an existential threat to Russia. I talked about this in a previous talk here. He's called the collapse of the Soviet Union the greatest tragedy of the 20th century, and has openly talked about trying to reconstitute Russia's greatness by bringing former republics back into the fold. This legacy issue is part of his motivation for invading and trying to absorb Ukraine currently. He became increasingly authoritarian as opposition threats at home increased, leading to, in recent years, the assassination of his political opponents like Nemtsov and Navalny. He used military force to support separatists in neighboring Moldova and Georgia and Ukraine, occupying parts of those countries, while supporting authoritarian pro-Russian leaders in other neighboring states like Belarus. And when the Maidan protests in 2014 forced out the pro-Russian President Yanukovych in Ukraine, which Putin viewed as a Western coup, he occupied Crimea, later absorbing it into Russia, and sent troops to aid insurrectionists in eastern Ukraine. Now, these frozen conflicts in neighboring states, whether it be Moldova or Georgia or Ukraine, prevented all these states from moving into closer relationships with either NATO or the EU, which was Putin's goal in the first place with doing that. Between 2014 and 2025, there have been many peace talks between Ukraine and Russia, including the Minsk agreements on ceasefires, which Putin then violated over 24 times. Indeed, all you have to do is, the big limited ceasefire pushed by Trump recently, in which attacks on energy and power facilities was supposed to be stopped. Putin violated that within hours. What happened to the Easter ceasefire it didn't exist. Putin announced it and then kept shelling. So that's kind of I think it's fair to say the Ukrainian skepticism about merely rhetorical Western security guarantees or a lack of trust that Putin will honor any agreement he makes is well-founded historically. Now, of course, the full scale of invasion of Ukraine by Russia in February of 2022, it had the stated goal of overthrowing Kiev's government, installing a puppet Russian regime, and annexing substantial parts of Ukraine. And all of this was further evidence of Putin's continued desire to restore Russia's former empire. It failed to achieve the rapid success that Putin and everyone else, including myself, expected when the invasion first happened, due to a combination of Russian military incompetence, dogged Ukrainian resistance, along with Zelensky's leadership, and the efforts of President Biden and the European NATO allies to come to Kiev's aid with military and economic support. So you had Western Javelin, anti-tank missiles, Stinger anti-aircraft systems, rapid delivery of additional military equipment and intelligence helped blunt the Russian advance. And the war settled into a general stalemate, with Ukraine taking territory back, but unable to break through. And the Russian advances where they were occurring usually being incremental. Over the past 3 years, the West slowly, and in my view, way too slowly, provided more advanced systems to the Ukrainians, whether it be the ATACMS, the HIMARS, the F-16s, the Patriots, etc., for fear of provoking a Russian overreaction. I think this was a mistake in retrospect, because Putin blustered threats with each delivery, but carried through with none. Putin was deterred as much as we were deterred of him. We should have probably been more aggressive in that. But the Ukrainians began a counteroffensive in 2024, and unfortunately, it fell victim to House Republicans in Congress, who were encouraged by Trump on the sidelines to oppose aid to Ukraine. And this greatly assisted the Russian cause, because what it did is it starved Kiev of the ammunition and materials it needed to maintain the southern counteroffensive. It began to run out of the artillery rounds, everything else that it needed. And unsurprisingly, the counteroffensive ground to a halt. This was a 6-month choking off of aid by congressional Republicans who seriously harmed Kiev. And what they did, aside from just blocking the aid, was they allowed the Russians to regroup and to renew their own counteroffensive as ammunition stocks ran very low. And then hypocritically pointed to this as evidence the Ukrainians couldn't win. Disingenuous and immoral are the least X-rated words that come to my mind. But the damage was done. And soon Donald Trump would come into office and make these previous obstacles seem insignificant. But I think what people don't seem to understand sometimes is that when you cut off military aid, it isn't like a water faucet. You can just flip it back on and immediately you've got water running through your hose. Okay, so that 6-month choking off of aid, it took months and months for the aid to start really flowing back into Ukraine. And of course, we've cut it off again at the moment. So what is the current situation in Ukraine and NATO and the Western Alliance right now? I mean, what is the impact of this radically different foreign policy? Well, in only 10 weeks now, I think it's fair to say President Trump has completely turned the post-World War II World War order upside down. The one that we had led for 70 years plus. Suddenly, American foreign policy that had been built on support for democracy and free trade, building and valuing our alliances with allies, and confronting authoritarian expansionist powers abroad was gone. In his first term, Trump was deeply transactional. We knew that. He didn't value treaties or alliances or the international community. I mean, in his first term, he pulled us out of the Paris Climate Accord, the World Health Organization, many arms control and trade agreements, actively questioned NATO. This had been expected in a second term, and he did. That immediately began to happen. However, unlike the original America First movement of the 1920s and 30s, which was more isolationist in nature, I think it's fair to say the Trump MAGA movement is actually not an isolationist one. I think people mischaracterize it as that, at least certainly as far as Trump applies it. What it is essentially it's a totally amoral, transactionally based, expansionistic, protectionist doctrine based purely upon expanding U.S. power that no longer seeks to advance traditional American values like human rights, democracy, self-determination, or free trade. In fact, those bureaus just got eliminated at State Department. I think it's fair to say it now more closely resembles the authoritarian populism of Putin's Russia, Erdogan's Turkey, or Orbán's Hungary. It seeks at home to usurp complete control for the executive branch, subjugate the free press, courts, and universities, and solidify one-party control of government. Abroad, it's taken the following forms: the imposition of massive protectionist tariffs against all of our main trading partners on a scale not seen since the 1920s and 30s. In fact, I think, and I know we have Katie's here, she could probably tell me, but I mean, I've heard that the tariff levels are higher than they've been at any point since 1932. And that's not exactly a great historical period that we want to emulate, the late 1920s and 30s. Repeatedly suggesting the seizure of Greenland, making Canada the 51st state through economic warfare, re-annexing the Panama Canal, taking control of the Gaza and making it the Riviera of the Middle East, etc. I mean, suggesting that the European Union was an adversary, questioning staying in NATO. In fact, I had dinner with Jim Mattis, who was Secretary of Defense for Trump. And, you know, he was basically saying that in the first term, Trump was intending to take us out of NATO. And he thought had he gotten reelected the second time, he would have taken us out of NATO. Well, we'll see what happens. We're very early on, in early days here. But certainly, he's already questioned our Article 5 security commitments, to the point where our European allies meet to discuss security and defense efforts to support Ukraine without us. In addition, we're questioning security commitments to Japan and South Korea, while calling for the removal of sanctions on Russia and resetting our relations with Putin while he continues the Ukrainian invasion. I mean, the irony of it is kind of interesting because Trump criticized the Obama people for their reset of Russian relations. Well, that's what he's doing. And with the tariffs, I mean, he imposed tariffs on everybody, including Ukraine. What country did not get tariffs imposed on it? Russia. So a very odd change in policy. It is, quite frankly, hard to imagine, and I've studied U.S. presidential foreign policy leadership all my career, written many books on the subject. It is hard to imagine a foreign policy more different than this from that carried out by all of our post-World War II presidents, from Truman and Kennedy and Reagan through even Bush. It is no longer sufficient to talk about a small change in policy. This is a seismic shift that changes everything about how America relates to the world, what we stand for, and we are only 3 months into this second term. Replacing the strong U.S. leadership of the NATO alliance and the EU in support for Ukraine's fight to save their democracy and independence, the transactional Trump has, among other things, described Zelensky as a dictator. He is not. That he said that he is unpopular at home, where in fact Zelensky has 68% approval rating. That he should thank us for cutting off or holding up his economic and military aid while Russia continues to advance. Demand that Zelensky hold elections and resign, even though it's illegal by their constitution to do so. And demands in return for further assistance, totally offering basically totally meaningless security promises, while demanding that Ukraine sign over half of all the mineral resources in Ukraine to the US to repay for future loans that Trump massively inflates how much we've contributed already. And he also wants repayment for all the military aid provided by Biden. The new proposal was even more extreme. Not only was it 50% of all the minerals, but also that they needed to put the proceeds from all our minerals and oil and everything into a special fund that the U.S. would control, that we would charge them 4% interest on, that we would control their ports, and that we would decide who they could trade with. and no explicit security guarantees whatsoever. As an international relations scholar, if we were teaching just general global politics, we'd call that colonialism. I mean, what is that other than making Ukraine a colony? It's a little reminiscent of, after the Germany-Soviet pact in 38, how they divided up Poland. Well, are we just dividing up Ukraine? I mean, Trump even suggested that the U.S. should own Ukraine's nuclear power plants as well. Somehow that's supposed to provide a security guarantee. So, gone is any sense that any other post-war president how they would have proceeded. Supporting an ally against aggression, or basically setting up a protection racket. Well, we're busy setting up a protection racket. During World War II, when the British were resisting Hitler's Nazi aggression in Europe, fighting, and Britain were fighting the Battle of Britain and had run out of money for war supplies, Franklin Roosevelt instituted the Lend-Lease program, where we loaned war materials to Britain, recognizing they wouldn't be paid back, to become what Roosevelt called the arsenal of democracy. FDR likened it to letting your neighbor borrow your garden hose if their house was on fire. Now with Trump, he insists on receiving half of the contents of your house before loaning you his hose, and then he wants you to repay him for the water. Thank goodness that we didn't conduct policy like that back in 1940, or Britain wouldn't have survived. Perhaps Churchill would have been told by us that he didn't have the cards, and maybe he should cut a deal with Hitler too. And when one doesn't learn from history, one is doomed to repeat its mistakes. I was struck by this when J.D. Vance gave his recent speech at the Munich Security Conference, Munich of all places, criticizing our European allies, questioning the support of Ukraine, and calling on it to surrender its territory to Russia. He essentially called for a policy of appeasement. And the White House then engaged in negotiations and discussions with Russia about Ukraine's future, what territory it needed to surrender, how it could not join NATO or the EU, basically conceding almost all of Putin's demands in advance. Do you know who wasn't invited to these peace talks, these discussions? Ukraine. Well, this happened before at Munich in 1938. Chamberlain, going to Munich seeking peace in our time, gave in to all of Hitler's demands, and the Allies gave away the Sudetenland territories in Czechoslovakia, where all of the Czechs' border defenses were located, gave it away to Germany, and again, who had not been invited to the Munich Peace Conference where their future was determined? The Czechs. The reality we face right now is that the Ukrainians are the modern day Czechs in this US policy of appeasement to this modern day expansionist dictator, Vladimir Putin. And just as this did not satisfy Hitler's appetite for further expansion, betraying Ukraine and handing them to Putin's Russia will not result in stability. Instead, it will exponentially increase the threat of Russian aggression towards other states, including Moldova, Georgia, Kazakhstan, the Baltic states, etc. And I think beyond just that local region, it will encourage China to invade Taiwan and seize the South China Sea territories, because in what world do we actually believe that the US won't act to defend Ukraine and European security, but would engage in a conflict with China to repulse an invasion in Taiwan? No credibility there whatsoever. Appeasement in the face of aggressive expansionist powers is always a policy of weakness, and eventually it undermines your security. Standing up to aggressors, creating policies of deterrence, and reinforcing our alliances and allies, standing up for international law, and not betraying our own values is the way to protect our security. And without real security guarantees for Ukraine, and I mean real ones that would involve European peacekeepers on the ground, continued weapons sales to the Ukrainians, etc., like something to deter the Russians from just taking the rest of the country, Putin will never compromise. He's never going to compromise. We've studied this guy for several decades. We've done psych profiles of him. I can guarantee you he will not compromise, and he's not going to just walk away. Putin plays the long game. And now he has every reason to not make any concessions, to hold on and just let the U.S. policy of appeasement weaken aid to Ukraine enough to allow him to win. And just to play along and stall and continue talking. You see it happening right now. It's happened for the last several weeks. Putin will, they'll, oh, well, we need to talk. We'll have another delegation. The whole time all these delegations are going, what's happening on the front? The Russians are still attacking. The Russians are still advancing. The Ukrainians are running lower and lower on ammunition. So, we've given Putin the aces in our deck, and he didn't have them before until we just handed them over. So here are the inescapable realities we face if we're looking just as policy people. Our NATO European allies are recognizing they can't trust the U.S. as an ally any longer, and they are trying to step up to fill the gap, not only in Ukraine, but also for their own security. And they have already spent far more money than the U.S. supporting Ukraine. Despite Trump's false claims of $350 billion in U.S. aid to Ukraine, I don't know where that number came from. The actual number is actually $128 billion. The Europeans, on the other hand, have spent $266 billion with another $121 billion on the way. So the EU has provided $387 billion, which is 3 times the amount of U.S. aid. But the reality is that, they can step up and provide economic aid and some military aid. Where this falls down, unfortunately, is that withholding America's advanced weaponry and our military intelligence from the Ukrainians, that's something that can't be compensated for by the Europeans. They don't have the extra ammunition for the Patriot anti-aircraft, anti-missile systems. They don't have the ATACMS and the HIMARS ammunition and some of these other things that we've been providing. So, this is going to be a significant problem for the Ukrainians. And I mean, the Europeans are rushing what they can in, but, we basically stopped helping the Ukrainians at this point. And the fact that they rely on Elon Musk's satellites for their military communications is even scarier from their standpoint. And this is the frustrating thing about this situation is that the Russians actually are at a real weak point right now. And if we were not just folding up our tent and walking away, the Ukrainians would have a good chance of being able to hold off the Russians and force Putin to the table. For example, sanctions are having impacts on their economy, and it is getting pretty severe. Now, it hasn't been as effective as we'd have hoped. By the same token, the one thing Trump has done that's hurt the Russians was his trade wars, because what's happened to the price of oil? Price of oil is falling, and that's the main revenue source for Russia. A significant part of the Russian federal budget comes from oil sales. It's their main export. So the lower that goes, that actually hurts Putin. But, Russian military losses have been enormous. I mean, we don't have the exact numbers, but we're looking at probably 900,000 casualties at this point. The Russians have lost at least 10,000 tanks, almost all of their modern battle tanks. They are so short of troops that they're relying on North Korean troops being brought in to assist. With adequate Western military aid, Russian victory is not assured even at this point. But, an appeasement strategy where you basically starve the Ukrainians of aid, well, that allows Putin to hang on. That allows them to continue the war whereas you might have otherwise had this conditions to force the Russians to negotiate. We're in fact giving every aid to, prevent a peace agreement at the moment. Now, on top of this, Ukraine has been subjected to atrocious war crimes by Russia, from indiscriminate shelling of cities and targeting of innocent civilians, well over 153,000 civilian dead at this point and counting, the abductions of tens of thousands of children who were taken from Ukraine into Russia, the displacement of over 10 million refugees, and a Russian occupation would be worse. Putin has been indicted as a war criminal in The Hague for these atrocities, and yet we're rehabilitating him. Just some of the pictures that you can see, some of the destruction that's occurred in Ukraine. The reality is that the Ukrainian economy has been devastated by the war. I mean, a year ago, the World Bank estimated that it would cost $411 billion to repair the damage in Ukraine. The Ukrainian prime minister at the time quoted $1 trillion. Well, with the immense destructions continued over the last year, I mean, I think it's fair to say you can probably double the World Bank estimate at least, with how much is far beyond the $300 billion of frozen Russian assets in European and Western banks could pay. We froze Russian external accounts. We've suggested in the past using that to either arm the Ukrainians or to help rebuild Ukraine. The Trump administration wants them to spend all that money to repay previous loans. So, more of a let's get our money and not worry about the Ukrainians sort of approach. So bottom line, as I kind of wrap this up, and so I can open this up because there's so many angles and so many things that we can talk about tonight. I think it's fair to say Ukraine will continue to fight because they have to. If they stop resisting, they will be absorbed into Putin's empire. Their independence and democracy will be extinguished. That's the reality. And Putin will delay, drag his feet, pretend to engage Trump in talks while continuing advancing in Ukraine, while coming up with endless further conditions to move forward with truces and ceasefires. I mean, Putin's demands have been so maximalist that he's demanded that Ukraine totally surrender, that the Zelensky government be replaced, have regime change, that they demilitarize, that they're only allowed to have a military 50,000 strong. I mean, we even allowed the Germans 100,000 after World War I, but no, 50,000. They're not allowed to join NATO. They're not allowed to rearm. We have to stop all military aid and intelligence sharing with the Ukrainians. And they have to give up all of the provinces that Russia is claiming, even if they haven't conquered all of those areas. That's the demand that Putin. That doesn't sound like a serious peacemaker there, but that is the game he is playing. It's a long game of delay, and if we allow it to continue, and if our policy remains the same, over time, Ukraine's situation will become weaker and weaker, and eventually Putin will get his way. It is fair to say that any peace deal has to include real security guarantees, not the fake hollow ones suggested by the White House so far. I think there needs to be peacekeepers. There needs to be an arming of Ukraine so it can defend itself against further aggression. They need to be allowed to have closer ties to the EU. I think it's inevitable that Ukraine's going to lose territory in any future deal. I think Crimea's gone. I think they're going to have to probably cede the territory the Russians occupy already. I think NATO membership's impossible in the near term, but we cannot just accept the Russian demands and allow Ukraine to just be cut up and parceled up. Because, some people talk about just having a ceasefire. A ceasefire is also damaging to Ukraine because what does a ceasefire do? It just allows the Russians to regroup, rearm, get more weaponry in that they're buying, surreptitiously from other countries, and they'll come back for more later. And the Ukrainians are very much aware of this because that's been Putin's MO from the beginning, and we've seen it repeated. So I guess we need to not allow this to be a new Munich 2025. We need to recognize that appeasement, just as it failed in 1939, will fail now. And so I'll leave it at that and just open this up for conversation. So kind of a lot, let me just get this stopping share. There we are. Okay. Am I back with everybody?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes. So we got about a little over 20 people here. So maybe people could just raise their hand and then just engage with you directly if they have a question or comment, if that's okay.
Sure, we can talk about the situation in Ukraine, we can talk about Russia, we can talk about the military, I can talk about any of it. So wherever you all want to go, I'm happy to chat with you. So
Marcia, can I take the first question, then I'll turn it over to you?
Yes, by all means.
So this is not exactly about Ukraine, but it kind of goes back to what you're talking about at the end about Trump's approach to foreign policy. And you mentioned, within 3 months, it kind of is kind of bringing to an end this structure of foreign policy, which in different ways has been around since World War II for about 80 years or so. And so, I mean, I'm assuming that where Trump is going, he's able to put into place, what would that international environment look like? Sort of beyond what you described for U.S. foreign policy.
Well, I think
for the world, what would it be?
Very chaotic one. I think you're back in a very much a multipolar world. The U.S. giving up leadership. I mean, it's really going back to the 1920s in many respects, and I think it encourages expansionists, not just in Russia, because I mean Putin has designs on Moldova and a number of these other places, and we know that. But I think it greatly encourages Xi in China to be more aggressive vis-a-vis Taiwan. And I think more damagingly is that, our one of our greatest strengths throughout the Cold War and up to the present has been our alliances, our allies, and having those. Well, who's going to trust us after this? I mean, if you're the Europeans, or you're the South Koreans or the Japanese or whoever, and you watch us essentially stab the Ukrainians in the back, and we've stabbed the Kurds in the back in Syria. We've done a lot of these things for allies that well, I mean, the Europeans are reaching a point where, they go their own way. And that's, I mean, to some degree, I think if there is any silver lining, I think the Europeans did need to be more leaning forward on their own security. I think that's a fair criticism. I've had that criticism of the Europeans, but by the same token, there's a way to do it that isn't totally destabilizing to the international security in the world. And just like immediate cold turkey doesn't make a whole lot of sense. And also, we need our allies to help us on things too. It isn't just a one-way street. And so it makes it very difficult to, if a future crisis did erupt, well, we can't necessarily be expecting our allies to back us up either, since we're obviously not willing to back them up. I think it encourages nuclear proliferation, to be honest, because I think you're hearing comments in Japan now that you would not have heard 15 years ago of maybe, well, given China's aggressiveness, maybe we need to get nuclear weapons in Japan. South Korea's talked like that. Poland has in the last week been talking to the French about that they would like to develop their own nuclear arsenal. And well, given what happened to Ukraine, can you blame them? So I don't see these things as necessarily a stabilizing thing in the world. And then you add into it this trade war, and all these tariffs on everyone. This is going to hurt the global economy. It's going to hurt all the countries' economies. So for Ukraine, I think the danger is that, if the economies in Europe start suffering, there's going to be less support in Europe to provide aid to the Ukrainians, right? It's also going to hurt the Ukrainians. But it's a very interesting episode of self-harm, because on a security level, on a foreign policy level, on an economic level, we're doing things that harm our best interests, and it's obvious that they harm our best interests, and yet we're still doing them. So there you are. Gary, you have your hand up.
Yes, sir. I've been kind of rolling something around in my head for a while. When the Cold War ended, the U.S. was basically the sole superpower in the world.
Yeah.
Then we became engaged in Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria. We really stretched our military almost to the breaking point, and they still have not recovered. They're still pretty worn out. And I wonder if that has kind of shown our adversaries like Russia and China, North Korea, that we are a more vulnerable country, that we're not that sole superpower now that we used to be, say, 20 years ago. And would that have had an impact, or still have an impact, on what Russia does, and especially now given our current president, and his foreign policy, that this amplify it even more.
Yeah, I think you're right. I do think it encourages Russia and China to be more aggressive. I think that when you watch the U.S. basically throw in the towel and basically undercut our own allies, basically almost dismantle our own. I mean, it wouldn't shock me at this point if Trump pulled us out of NATO, which would be just a horrific mistake. But yeah, I think that you're right. I mean, I think you've seen, we did like get a little too into regime change during the early 2000s in Iraq and elsewhere. And I think that hurt our credibility with our allies. And, we wasted a lot of resources on some of these conflicts. I mean, if you look at the total costs of Iraq and Afghanistan, I kind of differ. I think the initial invasion of Afghanistan was appropriate myself. However, it was then messed up by 4 succeeding administrations, because I knew the ambassador there, and it's like there was a window of opportunity right after the Taliban got kicked out where we could have stabilized the country and then gotten out, and instead we got distracted with the shiny object of Iraq, and then it sucked all the oxygen out of the room. And then you just ended up having this long drawn out, the worst type of, exactly what we shouldn't have been doing. And of course, Iraq, but you're looking at what, $6 trillion is the cost of those conflicts now, when you add in the costs of replacing equipment and medical aid to the veterans, all this other stuff. So yeah, that's a lot of self-harm there too. And I can tell you, I mean, there was tremendous damage to our European relationships under Trump's first administration. I mean, I was at multiple conferences in NATO with senior European officials during 18, 19, and Trump had done a lot of damage to that relationship, and they were all worried about. And at that time, Rubio and others that were there were going, "Oh yeah, don't listen to Trump. He, listen to Mattis, listen to other people. Where there are adults in the room." So I think the damage to the alliances and the damage to, I mean, Trump wants the Iranians to sign a new nuclear deal. Well, why would anybody sign a deal with us? What's our word worth? I mean, it lasts as long as a president, and then the next president come in and just tear it up. I mean, so a lot of relationships in the world are based on trust and confidence building. And when you destroy that, you can't just switch the light back on, even if you get a new president in. You know, some of this damage is long lasting, and the damage being done in the intelligence community and State Department, generational damage with the people that are leaving and being, I mean, I think you're looking at 15 years of damage right now to State Department and the IC. So, Nina. Can't hear you. You're on. There you are.
Sorry about that. Wow. Yes. Well, always a cheerful topic.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm a real buzzkill. I know I should probably wear a clown nose or something, so I, you know, have a little levity with you.
It's okay. We deal with this every day, and that's why I was out in my garden. And my husband is coming in from chopping wood. We just put in 7 cords of firewood, so that's the way we, you know, deal with this. But I did have
for the apocalypse and the rising price of gas. Yeah.
So no, I mean, the questions I had were about the mineral agreement. I don't know the latest. It's just a quick, short one, and I have a couple longer questions. What's the status of us signing that and Ukraine signing it?
Well, I haven't heard whether Zelensky signed it. There was still reporting out on that tonight. You know, but the demand was, I mean, they haven't really been talking about the details as much as the first time around. And I think Zelensky and the Ukrainians are afraid to say too much because it seems like, you know, a slight breeze sets Trump off. So, but, you know, what they had, I mean, they were still demanding the half of the mineral rights and the oil and the port control. And they wanted repaid for all the previous military aid, even though it wasn't a loan originally. And Trump's come up with this number that's more than twice what we've actually given them. But at no point, I mean, there was at one point when Zelensky came to Washington, there was sort of a sliver of a security guarantee talked about. That was stripped out in the new version. So from my standpoint, I'm kind of looking at it going, what in the world is in it for the Ukrainians to even sign this?
I hope they.
What? I hand over all my stuff and then you don't do anything to help me. Oh, that's a great deal. I love that. Let's go. You know,
Right.
It's ludicrous.
So he hasn't signed it yet.
Not that I am aware of, unless somebody has seen reporting this evening. I checked before I came on here, and you know, I think that they're planning to have a meeting tomorrow. I think so. I don't know whether that, but to me, I don't even. There's a part of me that thinks, yeah, the Ukrainians go ahead and sign it. If we lose our country, then you don't get anything anyway. You know, right. I mean, I mean, I don't know how Zelensky has, you know. It's just embarrassing. I mean, it's like Tony Soprano foreign policy, and it's embarrassing.
Right.
You know, it's distasteful in the extreme. I'm sorry, I'm trying to be controlled here.
Okay, it's okay.
I am censoring here a bit.
I know, and what we're all doing, at least in circles that I'm in Olympia, is that everyone is so upset with our elected officials, Democrats that they may be, because they don't appear to be taking action much that we notice. And where is the Democratic Project 2025 plan? You know, that may be policy and prose, and how are the Democrats translating that into some kind of poetry and getting the word to general Americans? So my question to you was, how connected are you with Patty Murray, Cantwell's office, congressional offices about your information and your presentation? Or what do you hear back from Congress?
Well, I mean, up until recently, I mean, I have not been sticking my nose into the political angle of this, just because as a university professor, I need to not necessarily do that. And because I have been a government consultant, so I mean, there's been kind of, although I've gotten doged, so it doesn't matter. I think that the Democrats are in a difficult spot. I mean, I think Hillary Clinton once said, you know, you have to get elected into office before you can do anything. You can say anything you want, but until you actually have some levers of power. And unfortunately, I mean, there's been protests all around the country, and you see a lot of Ukrainian flags at these protests, and you see a lot of, I think that there's a lot of support for Ukraine out in the public. And I think you see a lot of Democrats, AOC and Bernie and many others saying things out there. And I think it will increasingly, it's just one of the unpopular things Trump's doing. So, I think you're going to have a growing movement in that direction. I think sometimes we expect too much, because it's like we voted the Democrats out of all the area seats of power. So the reality is they can't really do much. Unless maybe if you have good elections in 26, and whether Ukraine survives a year at this rate, but what can they do beyond? I think the most important thing we can do is message and reach out to public. It's one of the reasons why I'm being a little more vocal than I've been before, and a little more blunt than I've been before in doing talks like to your group or to others. I've given a number of public talks on this subject.
Well, when I've talked to Senator Murray's office and Cantwell's office, they are asking us to send them specific examples of how our lives, our friends' lives, our families' lives are being impacted. And there was a family that came to the Olympia from Ukraine, is now being housed here. And their family that remains is in Sumy, I think. Gary was representation. And heartbreaking stories about that. And so we are not World Affairs Council, but the folks that I know, we are sending messages to our elected congressional officials saying, these are the specific examples. And then they're in turn using those as the best they can in committee meetings. So that's just a thing I was going to suggest.
And that's great that you're doing that. These are the sorts of things we need to do. It really comes down to creating awareness, because I think a lot of the public just aren't aware of a lot of these things. And it seems that a lot of the public only focus on some issues when it directly impacts them. And I think that's probably why the Cantwell and others were asking you for personal stories and things like that, because, trying to relate it down to the level where people that don't pay attention to the news, and there's way too many of those, and can see, oh gosh, this is bad.
Well, thank you for your presentation. Very good. Appreciate it.
Oh, you're welcome. Like I said, I think that Harvard and some others who are standing up and not being silent, and I think that this is a time not to be silent. I think this is a time when, there was, I think it was Edmund Burke, but I might be mistaken. I hate to misquote him, but they say, evil triumphs when good men do nothing. And I think that this is one of those times where, silence is acquiescence. Silence is what authoritarian regimes desire. That's the reason they're trying to silence universities, where they're trying to silence the 60 Minutes show, while they're trying to silence journalists. And the only hope we have is to not do that. Don't play by their book. Katie.
Yeah, I think Gary's hand was up. Gary, you want to go?
You're
already
muted.
asked one question, but I just had more of a short one. Just kind of look at a broader thing. USAID cutting off all of the funding around the world and the damage that done. The impact that's having in Sudan, Ethiopia, different places. Any comments on those, on that stuff?
It's awful. And I guess it's sort of like a party that continues to crow about morality, yet is instituting policies that's going to kill millions of people. Cutting off the HIV medicine, cutting off food aid to famine areas and things like that, cutting off, hypocrisy is fairly rich there. It's horrible, and I mean it's throwing away decades and decades and decades of good work and building good relations with others and showing leadership in the world. China is already trying to step in to take advantage of those situations. And it doesn't help. I mean, if you saw the reorganization that Rubio is talking about doing a state, they're talking about eliminating the Bureau of African Affairs. I guess Africa, nothing happens there. So we're going to get rid of what, 30 embassies and consulates in Africa? And, not we've already recalled our ambassador from South Africa because obviously he's enraged Elon Musk. So I mean, they've eliminated the Fulbright program. They're trying to eliminate the Fulbright program. They've silenced Voice of America. They've turned off our counter espionage, our counter misinformation bureaus at state. I mean, what are they doing? I mean, this is not saving any money. This is not saving that much money. What it's doing is throwing away U.S. influence and handing it over to China and causing lots of people to die in the process. I mean, we had a lot of medicine and food sitting on ships that they then kept in dock until the food rotted. Probably, hundreds of millions of dollars worth of food. That's government efficiency. But we're going to do a $78 million military parade for Trump for his birthday. Katie?
Yeah.
Well, thank you for your presentation. There's just so many different questions that come to my mind just listening to you. And I guess the biggest one is like, how did all of this happen? I'm sure you could never imagine you would be giving this presentation with the facts that you're presenting. With hindsight, can anybody see this coming? And is this just a Trump phenomenon, or is there something more kind of?
I think Trump magnifies it. I think he's a symptom of it. I think it's deeper than that. I think, Trump is the typical demagogue populist. He's very good at locking into underlying veins of bad things in a society. So, America's always had racism in the country. I mean, this isn't that long ago that there were separate drinking fountains, civil rights since 65. Native Americans didn't even have a right to vote until the 60s. So it hasn't been that long. But there's always been an element of that. And Trump was very, not even that subtle about, the first African-American president. Well, he must be from Kenya. He must not be a real American. He must, right? So I think there's some of those things. And Fox News, for example, has been a big problem with this because it's basically, it reminds me of Remya. It reminds me of the old Soviet government propaganda networks, because it is basically propaganda. It's not really a news network. And it just basically just feeds people this misinformation constantly. And I think the problem is that, we're kind of in this, it's kind of a perfect storm of, you have Fox News, you had all the talk radio for so long. You've got social media now, which, everybody occupies their own ecosystem, their own echo chamber. And so, even if you have people, I'm teaching a class right now. It's an intelligence analysis and analytic tradecraft class, but it's a whole class on critical thinking and how to recognize sources and how to use multiple sources to pull out, to get credible information and to judge, your sources by how much credibility they have and other things like that. Well, most people don't do that. And so most people kind of get captured by Facebook or by whatever. And then they just end up just having this disconnect. And so I think you're just seeing a fracturing of the American public. And I think it's feeding into this tribalism. I think it's feeding into this dynamic that you're seeing that now Trump and MAGA have kind of taken advantage of. But the earlier precursors of this was like the Tea Party and things like that. It isn't like this is necessarily a brand new phenomenon. And you see similar populist movements doing similar things in other places. I mean, Viktor Orban in Hungary, I mean, he gets invited to CPAC. And a lot of conservatives hold up Orban as the model for what we should do here in the US. Well, Orban has been rigging the elections in Hungary. He's been closing the universities down. He's been arresting the professors. He's been, doing all sorts of things like that. Well, that's what Erdogan in Turkey has been doing. What, 40% of the professors are in jail in Turkey right now? That illiberalism. And I think there's also a trend of anti-intellectualism in the US. And there always has been. There's a long history of that, dating back clear into the 1800s. But I think the COVID thing, I think people, because of all the other things I've been talking about, it's easier for people to fall into these conspiracy theories, fall into this, go down the rabbit hole like Alice. And I think people conspiracy theories, the more confusing the world gets, the more seductive conspiracy theories become, because they help to explain what you can't explain. Conspiracy theories are kind of the new religion. They kind of help you to explain that which you can't explain normally. My military colleagues would call the social media and all that a force magnifier. Basically that it magnifies the impact of these things that are causing disinformation, it's to the point where there's so much misinformation out there. And then you also have external parties like the Russians or the Chinese or others happily throwing more gasoline on the fire. And then you get political parties in countries all around Europe who, when the Russians interfered with the Brexit vote, the Tories were told the Russians were doing it, but because it was working in their favor, oh, that's okay. So as long as it's helping me and hurting my opponent, I'll go with it. There's not one answer to your question, Katie. There's not one. I think it's a combination of things which creates a truly toxic soup. There's lots of nasty ingredients going into this, and it makes it very difficult to snap the public out of it, because you're trying to provide accurate information, you're trying to get a message through, but you're also stepping into a blizzard. You're trying to tell people, look at that snowflake, but not all these other snowflakes that are flying at you the whole time. And I think that's the challenge. And sometimes, I hate to say it, but I think sometimes it takes a tsunami of bad feedback, bad things happening, to actually force people to reconsider their beliefs. Because people just psychologically tend to double down on things that they believe. We selectively process information to fit what we already want to believe. And when people provide us evidence that we're wrong, we tend to double down on our existing beliefs. We got a lot of bad, just normal psychology issues we're dealing with on top of the bad assist we're getting from social media and things like that. I know that's not a satisfying answer. I don't have one answer for that question. Tony?
Well, I'll ask you maybe a little bit of a nerdy political science kind of question, and that is kind of the role of federalism in all of this. You have that quote. I looked it up because I couldn't remember who said it. I guess it was Brandeis that said, the states as the laboratories of democracy, the pushback by the blue states. Certainly here in Washington, you have things like the law that was just signed earlier this week, or yesterday, I think it was, by the governor, that would allow the governor to prevent National Guard from coming in other states. Are there other things at the state level that can stem this anti-democratic trend?
Yeah. Well, I think you're seeing some pushback in blue states, as you mentioned, and Newsom down in California has been doing some of that. I also think it's important that Democrats choose the hill they want to die on, though. I mean, I think sometimes I think the progressives fight on every issue rather than, what are the issues we can really win on, and which are the ones that are going to discredit us with others. And so I think, and you can kind of in your own mind pick out which ones you think fall into which camp. But I think some of the ones that are protecting, Medicaid, some of the ones that are trying to prevent overreach of the government in impacting state universities, I think you see some of that happening. I think the issue is I think the laboratory you're going to see, unfortunately, is the red states are going to be lining up to, because the Texas governor's already, how can I get the next camp set up for you to put migrants in? How can I, so I think the blue states just trying to hold back a lot of the illegal activity or a lot of the illegal actions that are questionable legality, is going to be over, not the main show. I think the main show is going to be how far are some of these red states going to go now that they're not being constrained. And I think, just kind of adding another component to Katie's answer to Katie's question. I mean, I think the Supreme Court, not only has Congress abrogated its responsibility, Congress has abrogated its responsibility to be a check. But then the Supreme Court, that ridiculous immunity ruling, that was the sort of law a Supreme Court in a third world dictatorship, the sort of banana republic that Trump always jokes about. That's the sort of ruling that their Supreme Court would do. And when you have a lawless president or one who wants to push the law as far as they can, and then you basically say, oh, but you're immune to all prosecution and anything you do as president, what do you think's going to happen? John, Roberts has made his own bed here because now they're in a position of basically the Supreme Court can make a ruling and the Trump people can go, oh, make us. Where's your army? Where's your police? The Justice Department basically is not independent now. There's a real authoritarian slippage here. I think the next 2 years is going to be very revealing as to whether the American experiment succeeds or ends as we've known it. We at least made it 250, I guess. But what was it, Plato or somebody? Who was it that I thought it was either Mark Twain or somebody that all democracies hold within themselves the seeds of their own destruction? Well, are we witnessing that? I'm afraid somebody said that they were a nerd. I'm a history nerd. And so I can't help but watch what's happening. And, if you've ever read Tom Holland's wonderful books on Rome and the fall of the Republic, if you haven't read those books, I would encourage you to read them. But, you can't help but feel a few echoes of ancient Rome in what's going on here, fall of an empire. So, yeah, Marcia.
I'm sorry, Microsoft gave me an update I didn't want, and now I don't know where my raised hand function is. So,
I don't know the answer to that one.
The Ukraine scenario you painted is just so friggin' bleak. I'm curious, what's your best case possibility for Ukraine, and what's your worst case, and what's the time range are we looking at for either?
I think the best case scenario, and I'd say within the next 6 months to 1 year. Best case scenario is that the Europeans really are able to rally. They've been very impressive, and fortunately, some of the elections went well, so the Germans didn't have the far right party that J.D. Vance wanted to win. So the Germans are being very muscular. They've deployed troops to Lithuania for the first time since World War II to support security. And they're supplying a lot of weaponry. The French are supplying weaponry. The British are supplying weaponry. So, the hope would be that enough weaponry gets to the Ukrainians that they are able to hold back the Russians. Because the danger that's going to be coming very quickly is that right now, I mean, the winter's ending and it's sort of the spring. That's harder for armor offensives because the ground is soft in those areas. But as the ground hardens and it gets into the summer, I think that's a real danger point where you're going to see the potential for a big Russian counteroffensive or offensive, really. And you know, I think the best case is over between now and when the Russian offensive would start. If the Europeans can ship enough weaponry to the Ukrainians to hold their fort. And then that might force Putin to maybe reconsider, because he's having to consider another big 180,000 troop call up, and they're having to relax age restrictions on the draft. I mean, they're hurting in terms of that, and also with the oil issue and the price of oil going down. I mean, there's some headwinds coming for Putin too. So, and if we could get Trump to at least not be cutting off the intelligence sharing,
Right.
and provide some weaponry, because military intelligence sharing is not just helping the Ukrainians target, although they do. I mean, that helps them to do counterattacks, to break up Russian forces before they attack them, or to understand that an air attack's coming in or something. But we need to at least so if we could at least get some of the American aid going back in. Worst case scenario is that, I mean, the Ukrainians have suffered a lot too. And you can't just keep, in war, you just can't like turn the switch on and off and expect everything to just, oh, okay, we'll give them aid now, so suddenly they can do whatever. No, sometimes there's opportunities, and those are there or not. So the worst case scenario would be, Trump in his little huff cuts off all military and economic aid, ends the military sharing. The Europeans aren't able to provide enough extra support, and the Russians break through somewhere on a big offensive, and the Ukrainian forces collapse because they just don't have the weaponry or the ammunition. That's not an impossible scenario either.
If that were to happen, would Ukraine then be a vassal state? Would all of Ukraine become Russian territory?
Well, I think you'd see at least half of Ukraine become Russian territory. But Putin's original demands, I mean, I think originally Putin would have been happy with just overthrowing Zelensky, putting in a puppet, and then taking a bunch of territory, including Crimea and those 4 provinces. Knowing Putin, I don't really see that with how he would view this at this point, because a lot of Putin's motivation here is legacy. He kind of wants to be the person who kind of helps to reinstitute the Soviet Union. And if he had a total collapse of the Ukrainian forces and he could drive Zelensky out, or maybe, heaven forbid, Zelensky gets killed, I don't see why Putin wouldn't just want to take all of Ukraine. And then, he'd be right on the border with Moldova, where there's already Russian troops in Transdniester region. So that would be the next. I mean, I think, that would be the worst case scenario. And of course, then you would have, I think, a total fracturing of NATO, because, it would be apparent that the US just basically walked away. And now the Europeans would be much more, the Russians are right on their doorstep. I mean, the Poles, the Romanians, others, the Finns, the Baltic states. And anytime you're kind of setting the stages for a new Cold War, at least. but you're also setting up a very dangerous situation in the Baltics. Because part of Putin's MO has been to claim, oh, there's Russian-speaking groups in some of these countries, and therefore we need to support them and protect them. That was part of the Ukraine thing, right? In the East. Well, back in the 70s, there was in the old Soviet Union, part of the way that they controlled all of these different republics, because Russia was one of 15 republics. Ukraine was one of the republics. So were all 3 Baltic states that are now in NATO, part of the Soviet Union. They had something called the nationalities policy, where they would basically take ethnic Russians and move them into these republics to create populations that would be supportive of Russia, to help control those republics. And that's why in Estonia and Latvia and Lithuania, you have like 30–40% of the population are ethnic Russian, speak Russian, right? Well, the Russians are always kind of like, oh, all these Russians, ethnic Russians in the near abroad, there's like 25 million of them. So, we have an interest in bringing them back. It's kind of little too reminiscent of, Hitler with, we need to have all the German people together, the Sudeten Germans and sort of like, but, I've spoken to many Lithuanians and Estonians and Latvians who are very paranoid about the Russians. And of course, the Russians have been very aggressive already. They've done massive cyber attacks that literally brought the entire internet and banking system and government services in Estonia to a halt. I mean, this has already happened before. And so, I think it sets us up for a very dangerous period. I think that if Russia gets its way in this regard, I think it might be able to bully other countries into submission just because of the threat, even if the Russians don't want to actually carry it out. I think somebody asked about, the impact of the US being in Iraq and all these other things and how it might have shown us to not be as strong as we maybe appeared. Well, same thing happened to the Russians when they initially went into Ukraine. Everybody thought they'd just roll through and then, oh, look how weak the Russians are. Well, that's not going to be the storyline if they win, right? So.
Will that put more pressure on the European central banks to release these billions and make them available to Ukraine for war purposes?
Yeah, although, I'm kind of torn about that. I mean, I think the American demands that they use that to pay us for previous, is just so ridiculous that yet how much more do we want to steal from the Ukrainians, But, I would hope, and the Europeans have actually said, look, when several of the prime ministers were meeting with Trump saying, look, some of this, we didn't give this to them as a loan. We don't expect it back. We're not, that's not, I would hope a lot of military aid and stuff that would go to Ukraine would not be with strings attached, because we're going to need every bit of that money that's frozen. I don't think the Russians should ever get that. I think I could see Trump wanting to turn that money back over to the Russians as part of a peace deal, which should be a non-starter. But I mean, at a minimum, that money should be going towards reconstruction efforts in Ukraine after what the Russians have done to the cities and just leveled whole. I think it's a moral responsibility not to provide that money back to the Russians. And worst case, if they have to have it to buy weapons to survive, okay. At some point, there's going to have to be money to help Ukraine rebuild. I mean, I keep using some historical analogies, and I don't often do it because analogies are always imperfect. But, how stable will Ukraine be, even if we have a peace, if there's no money for reconstruction and the country is in rubble? I mean, they were in bad shape economically before the war started, let alone what's happened now. And so do you see the US or the European, is there going to be a new Marshall Plan to rebuild Ukraine? Because if there isn't, you're going to have a totally unstable political and economic system in Ukraine. Because how can you have stability if your economy and country's in ruins? It's the same reason why we rebuilt Europe after World War II with the Marshall Plan. we're repeating history. We keep not learning our history, unfortunately.
Jeez. You're not making us
Yeah,
happier, Tom.
Debbie Downer, sorry, I
I
know.
know. So, yeah, so I guess we should probably end here, and Tom's already generously gone over 20 minutes over, and so thanks. It was a great discussion. I realized if I was waiting for a upbeat moment to end this on, we might be here all night. But then on the other hand, to all of you, you knew the topic coming in, so I think it's I mean, it's good to face it squarely. So thank you very much for.
But it's now,
talking about
I mean, I do the talk, but now it's up to all of you to spread the word.
Yes,
And
it
Yeah.
is.
and to be ambassadors and we need to get the message out to as many people as we can, because that's the only way that things are going to change. And and I think we have a responsibility not to stab the Ukrainians in the back and walk away from them. I think that, if we do that, what does America stand for anymore?
That's
Right?